Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating and, frankly, incredibly dense text by the philosopher Abu Yarab al-Marzouki. We're going to unpack what he calls a medical prescription. But this isn't for a person. It's designed to treat the severe political and social crises facing entire nations today. You see, instead of giving us a standard political analysis, al-Marzouki offers a comprehensive, sweeping civilizational diagnosis. The scale of what he's proposing is just massive. So, let's jump right into it. Okay, so our diagnosis follows a clear step-by-step path. We'll start with philosophy as medicine. Identify the trap of caricatures, examine the conditions for civilization, isolate the plague of usury, and finally explore a prophetic strategy for liberation. Section 1, Philosophy as Medicine. We're starting our diagnosis right here in the clinic to establish exactly how al-Marzouki views the role of philosophy in society. Because you see, it is far, far from just abstract thinking. According to Marzouki, philosophy doesn't just theorize up in some distant ivory tower, it actively diagnoses. He argues that philosophical discourse is fundamentally a medical discourse. It looks at the behaviors, the social structures, and the historical actions of a nation, interprets those as symptoms, and prescribes behavioral medicine. Think of it like this. If society is the patient, philosophy isn't just a passive observer sitting in the waiting room. No, it's the MRI machine diagnosing the exact root of the illness. For a nation to actually survive and thrive in the long term, it absolutely must follow this civilizational treatment plan. Section 2. The trap of caricatures. Before looking at the cure, any good doctor first has to identify the false treatments, the ideological traps that nations stubbornly fall into during times of civilizational clash. And Marzouki brilliantly labels both of our dominant modern ideological camps as mere caricatures. On one hand, you've got the traditionalist. This camp treats a very specific era of the past as the absolute unchanging ideal. On the other hand, we have the modernist, who looks at the temporary dominance of Western civilization and treats that recent history as the ultimate final model for all of humanity. Marzouki points out that both of these are deeply flawed. Why? Because they mistakenly confuse short-term history, really just a blip in time, with the long-term universal flow of human civilization. They completely fail to distinguish between what is universally human and what is just a temporary cultural byproduct. Essentially, they're prescribing the wrong medicine because they're totally misreading the timeline of the patient. Section 3. Conditions of civilization. Moving away from these false cures, we need to examine the healthy anatomy of a society, building upon the framework of the legendary 14th century historian Ibn Khaldun. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that a truly healthy society requires a perfect functioning balance of two core conditions. The first is developing the earth, which represents our material civilization. This is all about how we interact with nature, agriculture, and technology to produce the literal conditions for our physical survival. But physical survival alone isn't enough, right? The second condition is stewardship, representing our spiritual society. This is how humans interact with one another to produce the conditions for ethical coexistence. A society is only healthy when both the material and the spiritual are working in perfect harmony. If you focus solely on the material, well, you lose your humanity. Focus only on the spiritual, and you fail to survive the harsh realities of the physical world. To bind these two halves together, Marzouki introduces the concept of mutual utilization. Think of this as the ultimate ethical symbiosis. In a healthy civilizational body, people serve one another not out of exploitation, but out of necessary cooperative survival. It's an intricate division of labor. And crucially, in this healthy state, human differences and superiority are judged entirely by piety and righteous action, not by race, not by class, and not by some specialized elite status. It's a system of mutual respect. Whenever this harmony of mutual service breaks down and morphs into domination, the societal patient becomes gravely ill. Section 4. The Plague of Usury. Now we identify the deep pathogen that actually corrupts this healthy civilizational anatomy, a dual plague that destroys societies from the inside out. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Here we find Marzouki's incredibly unique expansion of the concept of usury, or riba. Normally, we almost exclusively think of usury in financial terms, right? The usury of money, which corrupts material exchange by turning money into a tool of absolute domination rather than a fair medium of trade. But Marzouki argues there's a second, equally toxic pathogen, the usury of words. This is the exploitation of communication, truth, and media. Just as financial usury destroys material fairness, the usury of words destroys the spiritual and social fabric. Think about modern propaganda, fake news, or manipulative media. This replaces truth and trust with deception. It literally exploits our very ability to communicate with one another. So, what actually happens when a society is infected by this dual plague? Well, the symptoms are severe. Looking impartially across history, Marzouki argues that this dual usury leads inevitably to the creation of hidden deep states and mafias that operate entirely behind the scenes. They basically enslave populations by monopolizing wealth and monopolizing truth. As trust entirely evaporates from the system, human beings themselves are reduced to mere commodities. Physically, they're forced to sell their labor in exploitative financial systems. And spiritually, their minds and communications are entirely co-opted by the usury of words. It is, quite simply, a total systemic breakdown. Section 5, Prophetic Liberation Strategy. Finally, we reach the antidotes. Marzouki's strategic framing of prophetic models as specific medical treatments for these societal ailments. Marzouki maps out historical prophetic missions not just as spiritual events, but as highly targeted political and economic interventions. It's fascinating when you notice how specific the antidotes are for different historical symptoms. For example, Noah combats the tyranny of nature through preparation and technology. Moses liberates society from the crushing tyranny of the state. Then look at the economic interventions. Hud targets the corruption of hoarded wealth, Saleh fights against the deadly monopolization of vital resources like water, and Shuaib takes on fraudulent exploitative trade. Meanwhile, Lot combats severe biological and social corruption. Every single prophet is deployed as a specific antidote to a specific symptom of societal decay, treating the illnesses of their exact time. Within this historical progression, Abraham acts as the great spiritual pivot, fundamentally redefining humanity's relationship with the divine. And this entire historical progression ultimately culminates in the final message of Muhammad, which Marzouki views as the comprehensive, integrating strategy. It's a complete medical regimen that synthesizes all previous cures. It actively fights both the usury of money and the usury of words by perfectly harmonizing our relationship with both nature and the state, balancing that material development with spiritual stewardship. 12. That's the number of incredibly detailed, dense philosophical chapters al-Marzouki notes he has planned to fully unpack this massive civilizational worldview. What we've covered in this explainer literally just scratches the surface of the foundational theories he believes are absolutely necessary to understand before any nation can truly begin its healing process. The sheer depth of this diagnostic tool is immense. Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with. When we look around the globe today, at the staggering economic inequality, the persistent reality of deep states, the total collapse of trust in media, and the intense polarization everywhere, are these modern crises simply the predictable symptoms of a society that has failed to treat the dual usury of words and money? It's an incredibly provocative lens through which to view our modern world, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this civilizational diagnosis keeps you thinking long after we're done here.